A man dies, and his wife lives on. That might seem ordinary. People die, loved ones remain. But when that man is Niccolò Machiavelli, the father of modern political strategy, the author of The Prince, the most infamous manual on power the world has ever known, the fact that his wife, Marietta Corsini, outlived him by 26 years becomes something else entirely. It becomes symbolic, a parable, a mirror held up to the soul of power itself. Because Machiavelli wasn't just any man, he was the man who tried to crack open the machinery of control. He spent his life chasing influence, whispering in the ears of rulers, navigating courts and kingdoms, watching empires rise and fall. And yet, in the end, it wasn't his strategies that endured. It wasn't fear. It wasn't cunning. It was Marietta. Quiet, loyal, overlooked. The woman who stayed when others betrayed. The woman who bore his children, preserved his letters, waited through his exile, and finally buried him in silence. And here is the strange, haunting truth. The man who studied how to survive power couldn't survive powerlessness. But the woman who never sought power endured. To understand why this matters, we have to go back. Florence, 1498. A republic in chaos. The Medici have been expelled. The firebrand preacher Savonarola has been executed. And into this tempest steps a 29-year-old Machiavelli, brilliant, shrewd, ambitious. He rises fast, appointed second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, not through wealth or lineage, but through wit, observation, sheer intellect. He travels through Europe, negotiating with popes and kings, studying tyrants and republics. And then, he meets Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia, the iron-fisted, magnetic warlord, whose calculated cruelty and fearless dominance over the Papal States would inspire the very core of the prince. Machiavelli studies him obsessively, how he conquers, manipulates, secures power. Power, Machiavelli concludes, belongs to the bold, the ruthless, those who command fear, not love. But while Machiavelli is chasing power, writing dispatches from court chambers and shadowy halls, Marietta is back in Florence, holding their home together, raising their children, anchoring a man too consumed by ambition to be still. She rarely appears in his political letters, barely a footnote in history's pages. But she was there, always, just beyond the ink, behind the scenes. Then came the collapse. 1512. The Medici return to Florence. The Republic falls. Machiavelli loses everything: his position, his influence, his safety. He's arrested, tortured, accused of conspiracy. They hang him by his wrists, beat him for days. They don't believe he's guilty. They don't need to. They simply need to break him. And when they release him, it isn't forgiveness. It's exile. Banished to a tiny farm outside Florence, Machiavelli, once an architect of statecraft, becomes a ghost. Forgotten. Disgraced. And it's there, in bitter exile, that he writes The Prince. Not as a rebellion against power, but as a love letter to it. A desperate offering. A plea to be relevant again. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, he writes. But these are not the words of a man in power. They are the whispers of a man begging to be let back into the game. He sends the prince to the Medici, but the door never opens. He stays in exile, writing, hoping, fading. And through it all, Marietta stays. When he was tortured, she stayed. When his name was disgraced, she stayed. When the world forgot him, she remembered. She never wrote treatises, but her letters survive, warm, worried, quietly faithful. While Machiavelli obsessed over Fortuna, the cruel goddess of fate who tosses men like dice, Marietta became his constant, unshaken. And when he died in 1527, at just 58, poor, overlooked, his greatest work still unpublished, Marietta lived on. Not for a year, not 5, but 26. Long enough to see the prince rise from obscurity, long enough to see her husband become immortal. And yet, she never sought recognition. No fame, no credit, just presence, grace, silence. But that silence is deafening. Because while Machiavelli taught us how to seize power, Marietta showed us what it means to survive without it. Think of the irony. Machiavelli believed fear was more reliable than love. But in the end, he was remembered not because of his cunning, but because of the love that refused to leave his side. And maybe that's why she outlived him, because she didn't play the game. She didn't gamble. She didn't chase legacy. She simply stayed. And sometimes, staying is the most radical act of all. Machiavelli feared irrelevance more than death. He wanted his name to last forever. But legacy isn't just carved into marble or printed in books. Sometimes it's woven into the life of someone who refuses to walk away. In that way, Marietta became his final political paradox, a living contradiction to the belief that survival requires manipulation. She didn't rule with fear, she ruled with love. And she outlasted him by a generation. That should make us pause, because we live in a world that still idolizes strategy. We read Machiavelli looking for advantage, but maybe the real wisdom wasn't in the prince. Maybe it was in the woman he barely mentioned, the one who never sought power, but quietly held him through its loss. So when people ask, why did Machiavelli's wife live longer than him? They're not asking a historical footnote. They're asking a philosophical question, one that cuts deeper than timelines. They're asking, what truly endures when power fades? What remains when legacy goes silent? And the answer isn't fear. It's not control. It's love, the kind that doesn't need applause, the kind that waits, the kind that watches the storm pass and still stands. That's what Marietta gave us, not a philosophy of war or politics, but a quiet philosophy of presence, of faith, of survival. And maybe that's the truest mirror to the prince, because for all his brilliance, Machiavelli couldn't escape mortality. But Marietta, in her patience, gave him something he couldn't write for himself, a legacy rooted in the human, not the strategic. That's the cruel contradiction that defines Niccolò Machiavelli. We remember him as the ruthless thinker who taught rulers to be feared. But behind the myth was something quieter, sadder, more human. A man who in his private life wasn't a master of manipulation, but a prisoner of love, longing, and failure. His wife, Marietta, didn't just outlive him in years. She outlived him in emotional strength. While Machiavelli's name echoed through the palaces of tyrants, twisted into a synonym for cruelty, Marietta endured. Through exile, through poverty, through shame. She stood by him when no one else would, and he barely mentioned her, not because she was unimportant, but maybe because, to a man obsessed with control, true love was too sacred to expose. And that is the deepest irony. The man who wrote The Art of War, who built theories to manipulate empires, couldn't conquer his own hunger for affection. He wasn't powerless before kings, but before his own heart. Marietta didn't shape nations. She didn't influence dynasties. She simply stayed. When Florence turned its back on Machiavelli, she didn't. When his legacy was hijacked by tyrants, she outlasted them all. In that, there is a truth more profound than any chapter of The Prince. Power fades. Love endures. Machiavelli tried to master the world through words. Marietta mastered nothing and endured everything. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most Machiavellian move of all, to survive without spectacle. Because this story, this heartbreak, isn't just about a philosopher. It's about us. The masks we wear, the people we forget, the legacies we chase, and the intimacy we abandon in the process. We spend our youth building castles, climbing ladders, obsessing over control. But in the end, when the lights go out, we don't ache for thrones. We ache for connection. And that is where Machiavelli failed. And also, tragically, where he was most human. Behind the steel-cold advice, beneath the prince, was a man who didn't die with power in his hands, but with questions in his heart. And the woman who outlived him? She didn't just survive him, she redeemed him. She raised their 6 children during the storm of Florentine politics. She managed a household with no income, no certainty, no applause. And while Machiavelli wrote, "It's better to be feared than loved," she was living the opposite. She showed what real love looks like: loyalty, patience, presence. And yet, history barely says her name. That's not just a mission. That's the blind spot of our legacy-obsessed world. Machiavelli could predict political collapse, but not the emotional empire beneath his feet. And in that way, his life is a warning. You can conquer kingdoms and still lose your soul. How many of us are doing the same? Prioritizing ambition while ignoring the people who keep us alive? You see it everywhere. CEOs who divorce after decades of absence. Leaders who rise to power only to collapse under isolation. But the real hero is often the one who simply stays. Marietta buried him, never remarried, lived on in silence while the world turned her husband into a villain. But maybe the real tragedy isn't who Machiavelli became in history's eyes, but who he never got to be in hers. Because after all the theories, maybe he missed the only truth that mattered. Control is temporary. Love is eternal. If this moved something in you, if you've ever been haunted not by failure, but by the people you failed to love well, don't just scroll away. Subscribe. Stay. Because behind every philosopher is a forgotten name, a hidden ache, a quiet act of love that made their brilliance possible. And if we remember them, maybe we can stop chasing power and finally start choosing presence. And maybe that's the invitation. Not just to remember Marietta Corsini, but to reckon with what her story means for all of us. Because in a world that worships visibility, applauds dominance, and confuses recognition with worth, there is something quietly, almost rebelliously sacred about a life lived in the margins. We chase legacy like it's oxygen, racing for titles, hustling for influence, measuring our success in followers, promotions, awards. We read Machiavelli looking for edge, trying to figure out how to outmaneuver our rivals, how to be feared rather than loved in our offices, our industries, even our relationships. But what if that instinct, so deeply human, so thoroughly reinforced by culture, is exactly what's hollowing us out? Look around. How many fathers never come home in time for dinner because the boardroom won't wait? How many marriages fracture under the weight of invisible ambition? How many people rise to the top of their fields only to feel utterly alone when the applause fades? We know their names. Elon Musk sleeping on factory floors while divorces pile behind him. Steve Jobs revolutionizing the world while estranged from his daughter for years. Politicians, actors, CEOs, they shape nations, influence billions, and still find themselves staring into the abyss of disconnection. Because in the end, the world may reward your power, but it's love that keeps the light on. And that's why Marietta matters. Not because she was powerful, but because she proved you don't have to be powerful to matter. She stayed. Through poverty, exile, disgrace. She raised 6 children while her husband was off chasing courts and composing dispatches to kings. She watched the man she loved become irrelevant, mocked, and forgotten, and never left his side. How many of us can say we've done that? How many of us even believe that kind of love exists anymore? We're trained to be Machiavellian, to curate our image, to craft a personal brand, to treat relationships like negotiations. But Marietta offered something else, a radical presence. She didn't need strategy. She didn't need recognition. She was not the queen on the chessboard. She was the ground the whole game was played on. And maybe that's what makes her so important, especially now. Because in a time when we measure worth in likes, where love is often transactional, where presence is rare, and everyone's attention is fractured, Marietta becomes a mirror, a question. Who are you when there's no audience? Who are you when your partner fails? When your plans collapse? When the people you've invested in fall from grace? It's easy to love someone who's winning, easy to stay when things are good. But what about when they're tortured, disgraced, cast out like Machiavelli? What about when they're no longer useful? That's where true presence lives. That's where real love breathes. And here's the deeper tragedy. Machiavelli, for all his brilliance, might never have understood the treasure he had. His writings barely mention her. History doesn't remember her speeches, because there were none. She had no platform, no scandal, no triumph, just a quiet, unwavering commitment to a man who was trying and failing to outthink death. But she did something he couldn't. She lived on. 26 years after his death, long enough to watch the world finally open its eyes to the brilliance he so desperately wanted acknowledged. She witnessed the rise of the prince, saw the very world that shunned him begin to quote him, study him, immortalize him. But she never demanded credit. She never stood on a stage. She didn't need to. Because love that endures doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be there. In the silence, in the waiting, in the overlooked moments of loyalty that no one ever writes about. And that's the part we so often miss. The real measure of a life isn't how many people remember your name. It's how deeply you were known by the ones who mattered. So ask yourself, who are the Mariettas in your life? The ones who quietly carry the weight while you chase dreams. The ones who forgive, who wait, who stay. Maybe it's your mother, who worked 2 jobs and never asked for thanks. Maybe it's your partner, who never left even when you were unbearable. Maybe it's a friend who's always there, especially when you failed. We don't put them on magazine covers. We don't quote them in board meetings. But without them, the rest of us would crumble. To remind you that behind every great mind is an unseen heart. That behind every legend is someone who stayed when it was easier to walk away. And that's the real legacy worth chasing. Not dominance, but devotion. Not fear, but love. The kind that doesn't flinch when the world falls apart. The kind that doesn't need to be right, just real. The kind that, in the end, outlives everything else. So if this spoke to something buried in you, some grief, some guilt, some forgotten promise, don't just scroll on. Stay. Subscribe. Not because we want numbers, but because you need to remember that you are not just a strategist, not just a brand, not just a title. You are someone capable of being present, of giving grace, of choosing the quiet power that Marietta Corsini chose. The power to love someone not for what they offer, but for who they are when everything else is gone. And if we can learn that, really learn it, maybe we can finally stop chasing thrones and start becoming the kind of people who survive the fall.